So, good afternoon to everyone. I'm Chris Whitaker, Chair of the Steering Group at BASIS, and I'm going to be hosting today. So, welcome to another in our Wednesday webinar series. Today's session focuses on after the pandemic, unlocking sport. I'd just like to say a particular welcome to our audience from North America, Europe, and Scotland especially. Seems to be a good crew from Scotland today. So I would just like to underline that whilst this webinar is set within the context of Britain, the discussion is obviously universal and applicable to us wherever we are. And if I could just take a minute to say a few words about BASIS. When it was conceived some 10 years ago, it was always the intention of the association to become the voice for sustainable sport, or to put it alternatively, sustainability in sport. Our goal was always to provide the whole sporting community, and by that I mean everybody associated with sport, from participants, both professional and from the grassroots, the clubs and leagues that they play in, the governing bodies that oversee their sports, government and institutions that shape policy for venues, and of course the vital supply chains that keep events going. So we wanted to provide the expertise and the resources and the sharing of good and best practice to embed the principles of sustainability. The popularity, I must say, of these websites tells me that there's a very real thirst out in the sporting community for discussion and debate, and BASIS can lead that conversation. We're going through an exciting time at BASIS, bringing on board some highly experienced practitioners onto our executive team, which is in turn supported by a group of very knowledgeable practitioners that sit on the steering group, which I chair. So I would encourage all of you attending today to visit our website and sign up to it so that you can receive our communications, which are overseen by Anna and Dom Goggins, our communications director. Okay, so just finally, a little bit of housekeeping. Could you please mute? And if you'd like to contribute, and we would welcome that, please raise your hand and then we'll call you in turn. And also, can I suggest you change to speaker view so that you get the best experience of our contributors. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Russell Seymour, who's the Chief Executive of BASIS, to introduce our first speaker. Thanks, Russ.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, just to reiterate what Chris was saying, we've actually been really pleasantly surprised by the popularity of our webinars. There's obviously a great appetite for these, and we've broken the 100 mark today. And we're very, very happy that the popularity. I'm over directly to people. Today we're going to talk about lockdown. They're showing people teeing off at golf clubs, etc. We're aware that things have not changed in Scotland, and we do have quite a number of Scottish colleagues with us today. But everybody's going to face these issues. So really, we're going to look at a little bit at some of the specifics of the advice that's happened. But really, this is a bigger picture, and it's looking forward and looking towards what do we actually need to do. So with no more from me, I'm going to hand over directly to Pete, who's just going to introduce the subject. But again, those of you who've been on the calls before, this is
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Pete. I'm on the steering group of BASIS, and I work for a company called Rockvolt, and we deal with operations in the sports market, working with stadiums. And obviously, one of the big things we've been working with stadiums at the moment is how to reopen those kind of spaces, and how that might happen. So I'm going to share some slides with you and just give a bit of an overview and how all of this may fit in with sustainable working practices and how we can develop our sustainability through this process of change, because there is obviously fundamental change occurring. So at the end of this, open it up obviously to the floor, and hopefully people will be able to share some of their experiences and how things are affecting them. So there you go. So the big thing that we're looking at is this kind of key thing that people need to kind of balance how they can open venues, whether they're small or large, leisure focused or sporting venues, safely. There is this kind of dynamic of public demand and also financial implications, but at the same time the underlying fundamental is all about safety to staff, to participants, visitors and the public, and how you kind of get that balance. One of the things we've looked at is a kind of A, B, C, D, E approach, which kind of takes people through who are looking at all of this and looks at various bits. So the first thing really is the assessment, the A, and that's all about the safety aspects. A lot of this will be changing and is very fluid. Testing is a huge thing, which hasn't kind of come into any kind of mass participation for testing at the moment. It's still very much focused on key workers and people at the front line of dealing with the COVID illness. So that will change things as we go along, and that's a movable aspect. The other aspect that we're looking at when we got to assess is trying to create a biosecure element to a facility, a venue, a place, so that people coming in feel safe. And that has lots of elements to it as to how far you go on that. I mean, supermarkets have been open for ages. How biosecure those are is debatable. It's probably a fair amount of risk when you enter those areas. But there's this balance which everyone's trying to weigh up about how they can create spaces which are as secure as possible. The B is for blueprints. Now, there's a lot of documentation coming out already from various different sports and organisations, and obviously the government, about things which are specific to different sports. There's a number of reports now which are coming out. Football's producing things, golf is producing, cricket's producing, and they're all looking at how they can go about reopening and opening up from grassroots level all the way up to their elite level. Now, those kind of aspects and what they're looking at are looking at trying to define areas of how they can work, what the zones are, how people enter in and out and feel safe, giving timelines to those, and making sure that there's some form of access control and how people can control that. Now, amongst all of that, there are two big elements, which are the C and the D, is how you go about your cleaning and also disinfecting. And there's a kind of subtle difference there, as in cleaning is what we've known for all time, as in we need to clean places. The disinfecting aspect is something which is now becoming more and more prevalent, especially on touch points and areas where people kind of come into contact, how we can say that those areas are at that moment in time virus free and clean to go into. Those details are kind of more written about in the kind of insight on the website if you want to check out more of it. But what we also need to do is look at how we can bring sustainability into these aspects. And one of the big things there is to look at just simple engagement principles. These are kind of the principles that you look at for trying to engage people in anything, really. And one of the biggest things there is often to engage people fully, there needs to be a catalyst for change. And this is a huge moment. I mean, we are reinventing the wheel. It's really rare that we have to fundamentally go back and look at all this kind of steps that we need to take just to purely open a building or to allow someone in or to actually meet with anyone or participate in anything. Everything's having to be reevaluated. So this kind of principles for engagement, where people can look at how we engage people and what needs to happen to get people on board, these are very relevant to this time. And that means sustainability has a big chance, because we are re-looking at virtually anything that we're doing, and therefore how we then start doing them from now onwards gives us a chance to address certain things in a way that might not normally be looked at. And those kind of things do obviously encompass sustainable ways of working. And I think the big thing there is to look at the principles of what sustainability is all about. These are the main general principles that you'll kind of see from UN sustainability goals, and also the work that BASIS does with venues about looking at how they can work through becoming more sustainable in their practices. And the big thing there is health of your staff or visitors. Health and well-being and happiness is a fundamental sustainable principle. I mean, if you think of the additional costs and resources, time and effort, which is going into dealing with COVID, especially if people get ill, and the resources which are required to help them at their moment of need, those kind of principles are very much the fundamentals of sustainable way of working and the way of looking at things. So it is a primary consideration, the health and happiness of your staff and your visitors, participants, players, and all of those kind of people who are involved in coming into your venues and your environments, your facilities. So the whole aspect of sustainable way of thinking and the principles of what we want to look at can flow out from the decisions we're now having to make to try and reopen these venues. And of course, those kind of things, as you can see on that screen, they open up into a whole wide variety of aspects that really start looking at, well, we've got to make decisions about transportation, we've got to make decisions about procurement, we've got to make decisions about where we source things from. All of those elements have sustainable principles behind them, which we can help to start shaping how we start to look over the next coming month, 2 months, 3 months, half a year, and the years onwards, and how we operate in that way. So I think from a point of view of, we got some fundamental issues around the safety of our people, but coming out of that, we can also start looking at how we develop a kind of framework which works in a more sustainable way. So it'd be interesting now, there's the fundamentals and the kind of thoughts behind reopening spaces, and it'd be interesting now just to hear some of your views of what you're facing. And I know there's organizations here who are looking at wide-ranging governance issues, and there's also small local organizations looking at their particular facility, and it'd be interesting to hear what your thoughts are and your kind of understanding of how you might reopen your venues. Great,
thanks a lot, Pete. That was a great introduction. We've got Steve Isaacs from the RNA on the call today, and obviously golf has been one of the first sports to be able to reopen and get going again. So if Steve doesn't mind, it'd be really useful to hear how their planning went.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We're fortunate in that we were able to use the all-party parliamentary golf group to advise us on how best to work with government to put forward the case for golf. Since the early days of lockdown, we've been working with them initially to ensure that greenkeeping was seen as an essential practice. So golf clubs have been able to get greenkeepers in to do some minimal maintenance on golf courses. We've worked collaboratively with a lot of groups in golf, the greenkeeper associations, club managers. So the operational side, I think it's critical that we've engaged with them, but also people like the PGA, club managers, the national golf federations who govern golf in their own countries, to make sure that the messaging we were putting out was supported by the whole industry. I think we've done a decent job in getting the health and safety messages out. That's been the primary concern with regards to those messages. I think a difficult stage is going to be when clubhouses reopen, and when we have the general public, if you like, the golfers, moving in and around enclosed spaces. Although we have had some preparation for that, with greenkeeping facilities opening up. I think one of my concerns regards how we promote sustainability through this period. A lot of, particularly with regards greenkeepers and the future of greenkeepers, a lot of greenkeepers have been furloughed, a lot of greenkeeping staffs have been reduced to about 30% of normal. And we're being very careful not to push out the idea that this is a great opportunity for sustainability, if that might be tied with greenkeepers losing their jobs. So we're being very careful with our messaging. We're utilising all the expertise we have to hand. And I think, again, the most important point is we're being very collaborative with everything that we're putting out.
Thanks, Steve. That's a really helpful insight. Pete, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think we in a previous webinar last week, we were talking about this kind of view of whether sustainability and some of the messaging can antagonize at this moment in time, when obviously the primary focus is on people's health and people's well-being. But I think the interesting aspect with sustainability is often the terminology, as in, obviously climate change is a huge element, and how we're working with the environment, and how we're using water and how much carbon we're producing and all of those kind of things. But if you look at the broader aspect of sustainability, I think that has a massive part to play in just a sensible kind of discussion, because like on the previous slide, the health and well-being of staff and and how we make sure that that's fundamental is a huge part of sustainability, because it's one of the primary aspects. And then as things spring out from that, like Steve was saying, there's an element of what you can do at a certain time, and then how you then look at opening up, like say clubhouses and things. There's different factors then go into that. But I think there is an opportunity here. I mean, one of the final comments on where we're at with sustainability, there's also an aspect of being able to look at things from measurements and data at quite a low level, which is rare. We will never have things which are so kind of like not operating, as it were. So as we do open up, it kind of gives tremendous aspects to people working in facilities and maintenance and operations people, to actually look at how they're using the facilities and what kind of impact that's having as they open up things. So there is opportunity to do some work which we would normally not be able to ever do.
Thanks, Pete. So something's just come up on the chat, Steve, which I don't know if you've had a look from our colleagues in Scotland, just making some observations about obviously the differences between Scotland and England. And
yeah, I disagree. We have had lots of collaborative work with Scottish Golf, with the Golf Union in Ireland and with Wales Golf. I think the fact that golf clubs in England have opened has been a government decision, not one from the R&A. And certainly the latest version 3 of the Essential Maintenance Guidance we've published, which you can find on the bigger website, clearly outlines the difference between the situations in England and the rest of the United Kingdom.
Thanks. I see we have a few colleagues from the NFL in America on the call. if one of them would be happy to share some experiences, and certainly from a different perspective, that would be interesting. Could somebody talk to us?
Hey, this is Hannah Capel.
Hi, Hannah.
Hey, so we have Hannah and Catherine. I don't know if you have anyone joining us from the US. We both work out of the London office for the NFL.
Okay.
So
Fine.
to be honest, we really joined today, and thanks for the invite and the opportunity to listen in. We're at the early stages. So being in the UK office, the decision was made for this year to not host any international NFL games. So the whole of the season for the National Football League will run in the States. So we currently had 5 games scheduled to play internationally. So that was 4 in London, 2 at Wembley, 2 at Tottenham, and then 1 in Mexico at Azteca Stadium. So totally agree with the decision to sort of keep the players safe, keep the staff safe, assess the situation, hope to start the league up and the season as it should have started up in September, but whether that's going to be behind closed doors or not, there's lots of conversations happening. I think the interesting thing out in the States is that lots of different, sort of all across the States, they're considering different options. So there's lots of factors to take into play when you're sort of traveling all around America. But yeah, if I'm totally honest with you, we've really jumped on to listen to how other groups are doing in the UK and sort of around the world, just so we could learn from you guys as well.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, absolutely. And that, as I said in the sort of preamble, about obviously sharing best practice and trying to share experiences are really important. Anyone else from perhaps some of the local facilities here in the UK, please come on the call and share experiences with us. This really is about a collaborative discussion.
I think also, Chris, I mean, one of the big things, this goes back to Hannah as well, is there's an element of opening up things for staff and people kind of doing their jobs in these facilities, which has major ramifications and ways to work through. But the other aspect is also the opening up then obviously for fans, which is a whole different ball game. I mean, I think that aspect we're a long way away from at the moment. I mean, the focus really is on the facilities for staff and then participants to actually get some kind of sport going. But any kind of fan stuff, I think, is a long way away.
I know that there had been listened in on a few other calls and reports that were going out about trying to implement social distancing within stadium venues, and I think the stat was if you sufficiently could adhere to the guidelines that we're currently experiencing, then you would go from having a 70,000 venue down to something like 3,000 if you're actually able to get some people in. And it's a case of taking out seats to get people to the toilet, how merchandise would work, and there's so much to be factored into that it almost becomes the discussion of, is that a route that you want to even go down to try and open a venue with social distancing, or is it a case of testing? And there's so many things to consider. It'd be really interesting to know kind of anyone from venues in the UK here, what discussions have been had.
Thanks, Hannah. Just while somebody's getting ready to jump on, Jade, do you want to perhaps articulate your comment that you made on the chat about reduction in cash?
Yeah, of course. So I was actually on another webinar this morning. Seems to be what much of the day entails. It was actually the one around the facilities management of the venues. I think it was 700 of facilities managers is on that call, and one of the sort of key discussion points sort of touches quite nicely with this was around actually with the impact of cash, knowing that businesses are obviously strapped for cash at the moment. Some venues may not even survive potentially. Huge challenges at the moment. Actually, would that restriction in cash have an impact on sustainability? And I think ideally no would be the answer to that, but obviously some businesses, will sustainability be at the top of the agenda at the moment? Probably not. I think the key priority may be around actually surviving, being able to pay wages at the end of the day. But there were some sort of suggestions around how you could potentially deal with that situation. I think one of them was around data. So actually utilising the data you've got at the moment to understand if there's some quick wins around how you can, like Pete alluded to earlier, use that data to benchmark and work out if there's some quick wins in terms of savings on your energy front. That'll also potentially then have an impact on some carbon reduction. And then the other thing that was emerging and is coming to the sort of forefront in the marketplace at the moment is sort of energy as a service propositions, where actually you don't, the client wouldn't have to put the cash up front to implement some of the initiatives. And some of the businesses out there, I mean, Engie is one of them, one that I'm fortunate to work for. They're putting the cash up front to implement some of these, the infrastructure to get to zero carbon. So it's recovered through like a longer term contract. So actually the client's going to see the benefit, and the service provider recovers their cash through some of the savings that are implemented. So there are options out there if people are faced with a financial barrier as to how do I move forward. I know there's some great things to do, but what can I do, knowing that my number one priority is for the business to survive, but then secondly, obviously want to hit that carbon and sustainability agenda. So it was quite promising on the call this morning that there is still some good thoughts out there in terms of how you can deal with that particular challenge.
Thanks, Jade. Darren Crossman from the Principality Stadium's got his hand up. If you'd like to jump in, Darren.
Yeah, sure. I mean, reiterating a lot of those points, but at the moment, I mean, we're certainly looking at all of the options, and some of the options is, you know, sport may well resume, but behind the closed doors in the initial phases before we can even get to the processes of getting spectators, or even consider getting spectators through the doors. But you know, just to pick up on some of the points that were made, we've run some numbers and etc. And I've been trying to do some modelling over the last 5 weeks of how you would get spectators through the doors. And at the moment, aside from the issue of actual numbers of seats and how you accommodate the people, there's things, you know, going back to what Pete was talking about, the service element of, if somebody uses a toilet facility, then you've literally got to follow in behind them with a cleaner, so and make sure that area is then cleaned and sterilized. So the whole operation at the moment, whilst there is a COVID contagion aspect, is just huge. I guess as things move on, and later on as a vaccine becomes available, I mean, I think we're probably looking a couple of years down the line before we even get full spectators back into, and I'm not just talking about a stadium, any venue in any significant numbers. Realistically, I think you're probably more likely to get spectators stood around the side of a football pitch, a rugby pitch, or a cricket pitch, where they can socially isolate themselves or socially distance themselves before you get to international and major stadium occupation again.
Thanks, Darren. Russell, you wanted to pick up on what Jade had said.
Yeah, and hopefully you can hear me this time. Sorry, I think I broke up when I spoke a bit earlier, and hopefully my connection's a bit better now. And there's been some response on the chat as well around the issue of financial aspects of sustainability, and many of you may have heard me say it before, but it shouldn't be an issue, and I think it's partly ignorance. I don't say that in sort of a bad way, but when people are kind of challenged with this new idea or what they perceive as a new context of sustainability, and the idea that it's something different and something that's added on and something that's difficult and scientific and going to have to do things differently, is something that we really need to address, and certainly something that BASIS wants to do. All sustainability is in our context, in our sports context, and the way we manage things, all it is a way of doing it. Everybody is doing all the things anyway, just do them in a more sustainable way. So every venue, whether it's a local cricket or rugby club, or whether it's up to a Lord's or Principality Stadium or Wembley Stadium, whatever, you do cleaning, you do catering, you do all of these things, you do waste management. It's just the way that it's done. So the whole perception that it's something that's costly, something that's expensive, is something that we really do need to shift that mindset. And it's innovative people like the people on this call that are actually thinking about that are able to actually move that agenda forward, and actually try and convince people that it shouldn't, you do need some expertise, clearly, and that's why we're talking to each other. But it's not something that is really difficult. It's just the way that you do it. And I think at the moment that there is a shift in mindset. People really are seeing that the sky is more blue and the birds are singing more loudly. It sounds a little bit twee maybe, but people are noticing a closer connection to nature, and I think people are appreciating that. And if we can put that out through sport, which is one of the most powerful social media there is out there, the passion that people have for sport is incredible, and that's the motivation, I think, through sport, that we can actually make some changes, and to take an opportunity now to review the way that we manage facilities of whatever size is an opportunity that we really shouldn't be missing. So I think huge responsibility sitting on basis over the coming months. We really want to start connecting with some of the bigger venues, some of the governing bodies, to really start having these conversations and trying to embed this in. And it's something that the governments are doing. We mentioned last week the conversations that the UK government, the EU, Germany, all sorts, lots of other countries have actually committed to saying we need a green recovery. Whatever green means, but we need to be looking at climate change. We need to be looking at all of these sustainability issues and come out of this in a much more sustainable fashion. It's a huge opportunity. We can't just go back to the way that things were.
Thanks, Russ. I saw that Alan Herskovitz had signed in earlier. Alan, are you there? And would you obviously have a worldwide perspective, perhaps, on sustainability, and obviously I've seen it in lots of different countries. Be interested to hear your thoughts on how we cope. It sounds like that went into the ether. Okay. I'd like to ask anybody who's connected to grassroots sports to perhaps just give us a quick view from their perspective of what it's going to take to perhaps bring a grassroots club back into play. And obviously I'm a member of one, lots of you are, and given that the revenue that most clubs generate is through their social activities, is it going to be feasible for them to be able to reopen their sporting side of their businesses if they haven't got the social side to underpin that? So if anyone out there is involved with running a local club, I'd be interested to hear from them. Anybody? John, would you perhaps care to comment?
Sorry, I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just put a comment on the chat, actually. I mean, I'm sort of wearing 2-3 hats here, because one is I'm involved in running a cricket and tennis club, recreational local community club. Secondly, I'm involved in a network of people who run cricket clubs as a peer discussion group. And that's about 900 club clubs, so probably generally the larger clubs more focused on club development. It's clearly one of the sports that's impacted because we were just about to start our season. There's got to be a reasonable risk there won't be a season at all this year, and that has huge financial implications for the sport generally. Tom Harrison, the ECB chief executive, last week in the Parliamentary Select Committee, suggesting it would cost possibly £380 million for cricket. At local club level, it's clearly a big impact. I think clubs that are eligible for government funding, which they are because they do have quite often sports premises that are recreational social facilities, those have been able to access the government grants, furloughing, business rates relief, or the holiday. I think they are generally reasonably comfortable they can see through this year, but they don't want to start looking beyond this year. I think quite a number of them are facing real problems if this drifts on into 2021. Clearly there are clubs that have been struggling for quite a time that this might signal the end for, and nobody really knows, I don't think, what that shakeout might look like in 2020, but certainly I know of some clubs that this is the final straw. I think the big issue comes if there is going to be no cricket this year to be played, how that impacts on participation and the retention of membership. But in terms of the social and funding aspects, a lot of clubs do rely on bar income. That is going to be a major issue longer term, but right now I think the government funding has helped out in that respect. At the moment, the biggest issue seems to be around subscriptions. Subscriptions probably are the second largest source of income for most recreational clubs. Something like 50% of clubs saying that they're not expecting to collect more than 25% of the subs they collected last year. Probably in most cases that's 0%. Something like 70% of the clubs were expecting to collect less than 50%. So that's going to be an issue. That's not about retention necessarily, that's just actually not being in a position to ask people for subscriptions when they're not likely to get any sport. So that's the sort of the picture really at club level. It's really, let's see if we can get some play going. We're waiting imminently for guidelines that might allow cricket to begin practice in the same way as golf and tennis. And later in the summer to get some form of on the field activity, even if it's severely constrained, which sort of probably predicates against league cricket, but at least it could allow friendly activity, friendly matches against other local clubs to avoid travel and to allow the sort of rather strange conditions we would expect to see in the current circumstances in the actual play, but at least it's some fresh air and some activity that will justify clubs extracting income from their members.
Thanks, John. You raised a lot of really important issues there. And obviously the fallout from this, as you mentioned, clubs closing, these are local, very local clubs. It has a big impact, you know, not just on the provision of sport, but also on the whole community support and all the rest that clubs obviously provide as part of their role as a community facility. I'd just like to move on. Julian, you made some comments there about collective responsibility, and I'd just be interested to hear a bit more about that, and I see you've had quite a few responses to that. Julian Kelly?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks for that. I think Pete mentioned in his presentation about the status of supermarkets in terms of their biosecurity as such. And I just wanted to raise the point, and perhaps it may be somewhat controversial, but we spend a lot of time at Clean Event. We normally clean stadia and venues, but we've been cleaning a number of hospitals and providing cleaning staff at hospitals. And it has been interesting for me to observe the etiquette in places like supermarkets, in places like communal areas and hospitals, to observe the reduction in people's sensitivities around social distancing and a slow breakdown of barriers like the 2 meter rule that have been widely spoken about. Now, I'm not making a statement about whether that's a good direction for us as a society to go, but I do perceive it to be the reality in the wider world. And I do have concerns. I mean, and the number of people who've already said that sports clubs and venues are really on their knees and this is a crisis time for everyone in the sector. Are we slightly missing something of a trick here by you know, I'm making a point, perhaps, you know, turkeys voting for Christmas in some regards. Is it incumbent of us to look at what the actual risks are, look at the statistics in terms of infection and deaths, and set a different agenda that takes away the fear of being around people?
Thanks, Julian. Russ, would you like to come back on that, or Darren, from either your perspectives as
I think it's a difficult question to answer at the moment. I mean, there's so much unintentional fear. I think it's necessary that the media are still telling us that there are big issues with this disease, and I think that's going to take a while to pass. But I think there are two ways that I think there are two ways that a pandemic will finish, and I won't take credit for this. I was reading an article the other day that there's sort of a medical termination where, you know, the doctors will say either there's zero infections or it's such a low level that really the disease is no longer of concern. But there's also the public aspect, and it will be the point where the public almost lose interest and the media lose interest. And I don't mean that, you know, we're just fed up with it. I mean that it's no longer directly relevant to our lives. So clearly both of them have got to have a low level of infection going on. I think there will be a point where people are prepared to come back into venues. There's bound to be. There's too much passion and interest in sport. And look, I don't mean this in any kind of irresponsible way of encouraging people back too soon or whatever. It's still got to be safe, and venue managers, etc., still have to be confident in cleaning regimes and movement and whatever. But there have been pandemics before in different parts of the world, you know, clearly in different times. This is something very, very new and unique for now, but we will come through this. We have to come through this. There will be a time where that narrative is changed and people will just decide. I think at the moment there are people who are starting to be fed up with social distancing, and, you know, in the supermarket, I was in a supermarket yesterday, turned around and there was somebody 6 inches behind me, just stood there looking at the shelves. I was completely unaware. So some people have already lost some of that social distancing aspect. It will progress as the messaging starts to, as the fear starts to come out with the messaging. And I think there are already positive movements towards that we can start to participate in golf and in tennis and some other sports.
I think the big thing is like where Julian's coming from is confidence. I think one of the things that we've tried to do with in my work with various clients is try to set up practical ways of working that give staff or visitors or participants confidence that A, you're taking this seriously, and B, that they can see tangibly what you're doing is sensible and you're doing all you can to minimize the risk of people being in that environment, whatever it may be. I mean, the interesting contrast is going back to supermarkets. Just by coincidence, I was in a supermarket today. I think that's probably actually at this moment in time the riskiest place I go. As in, there's no real barrier to entry. I don't really have to do anything as I go in there. People are touching stuff all over the place. And people are getting close to each other, and it's all a bit of a, people are meant to go one way and they don't because they forget the milk down the aisle, and all of that kind of stuff is hard. Whereas I'm also doing some work with Harrods. They at the moment their process of actually even entering the building is quite complex, as in what you have to do to kind of, as in sanitizing and your accreditation and who they know who you are, and then where you're going in the building and the route finding and And, you know, they've got massive lifts. You're only allowed one person in a lift. You know, they've got massive policies which they've implemented, which actually gives you confidence that things are, to be able to do what we're doing there is we're in quite a safe environment. And I feel assured that that's been taken sensibly. And like I say, I think I'm more at risk buying my milk down Tesco's.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, I know certainly what the Tesco run is like, or any other supermarket. Okay, to continue the conversation, I saw Steve Isaac made a really interesting point around community clubs and golf. He was talking about in particular and looking at innovative ways of that they need to re-examine their business plans in order to survive. Come with alternative ideas. I saw in the chat somebody mentioning about stadiums setting themselves up to become drive-in theatres, which interesting idea. And I could imagine most greenkeepers would not be too keen to see people driving all over their lovely curated grass. But Steve, do you want to comment a bit more on that point you made?
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity here. I mean, for a number of years now, we've been pushing, particularly with the Scandinavian Turfgrass Environmental Research Foundation, the idea of golf facilities being multifunctional. There's a lot of land on a golf course. There are a lot of other people who could get benefit from use of that land. And there are opportunities out there for golf clubs safely to invite other people in to take advantage of the area they have available to them and the facilities that they have available to them.
Thanks. Teresa, you made a good point on the chat. Would you like to expand on that?
Muted. Can you hear me?
Can do.
And
Yep.
Okay. All right. We've just been talking about the more local issue of social distancing, but you know what we've seen across the country recently during this pandemic is, you know, Wales is closed to visitors. You know, don't come to Scotland, don't come to various. So I think there is sort of some work to be done as part of this to change the mindset so that hosting communities will accept, you know, people, the fans, the audience coming to their town, their city, to actually attend these sporting events. And that's another thing that, you know, sadly has come up, but it's a hurdle that we're going to have to get over on a more macro level across the country, I think.
Thanks, Teresa.
Okay.
Okay, if anyone else would like to jump in, there's a lot of good chat going on the group chat. If anyone would like to articulate their points further, please do so now. Or I'll have to get Pete back in to talk. Okay, Pete, you might want to just pick up a couple of those on that last slide of yours. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it was just that I made a point there about cycling, and I just wonder that I think Russell made a point about people having to respond in some sort of structure, and there may be a danger that if there isn't a structure put in place to help things return to some level of new normal, that people may just react in their own way. In my sport alone, they've been really strict with British cycling to reinforce it from an insurance point of view. A rider shouldn't be out in a group. And if something happens in a group, you're going against the guidance, and your insurance through British Cycling would then be invalid. And the same goes for me as a coach. I can't coach at the moment because it's invalid until they give the green light. I just worry that if it's not structured and not brought back in a structured way across all sports, people may just take up their own idea and say, well, just do it anyway. And from my sport, I don't want to see groups of 20 people out on a Sunday morning presenting risks from a reputational point of view. And it's the same across all sports. Do you really want people taking control themselves? When if there's some structure put in place that allows it to return at a slower speed but in a better way, that might help everybody.
Thanks. That is a good point about policy and kind of some kind of framework being developed as quickly as possible to give sport as much guidance as possible in terms of, you know, how they go back in a safe and secure manner without obviously contributing to any spikes in the infection rate. Pete?
Yeah, I think with regards to some of the comments like Julian's coming from the reopening aspect, it is about giving confidence to people. So if you're looking at staff teams and people working in areas and all of those aspects, it is about putting in procedures that give them confidence that they can go there and be as risk-free as is possible. I think one of the things which everyone is waiting on, which will be the next stage of where we're going, is a wider rollout of testing. The basic problem and fear with a lot of people at the moment is you don't know if you're standing next to a carrier or you're not. It's just, they're just unknown, and the wider aspect of testing will change things, because if you can get to a process where we've got far more people being able to get tested, that then gives you that kind of understanding that that there is a safer environment to be in, because that may be one of the access controls to be going into that environment. So we are on this journey, but unfortunately we're in a bit of a groundhog, really. I mean, a lot of the things that have changed are subtle changes, but the basic premise is, you know, we've got the social distancing aspect is the thing that causes sport the biggest problem, because that fundamentally is something that doesn't normally happen. Social distancing, the whole point about sport is you participate as a team, or even if you're an individual, you're kind of with other people, and obviously the fan part, and that causes huge problems, massive, more than probably many other industries. Just simply the social distancing is a hard thing to get through at the moment, and all the things that we're looking at with regards to reopening is all about trying to allow people to feel that the environment they're coming into is as safe as it humanly can be, whilst recognizing there's still risk.
Yeah, and that brings a lot of challenges with it. And I just want to share a sort of personal thing. So my wife runs a Pilates studio and is really kind of looking at reopening it. And one of the things is about obviously trying to protect people in a reasonably small space. So she's been looking at different options, and Perspex and acrylic are, you know, two obvious ones. So talking to the manufacturers of those, they said the demand for that has gone through the roof. Well, you can imagine there's going to be a tidal wave of the stuff that's going to be left over, you know, after, let's say, a year's usage. And, you know, what happens to all that? Where does that's all this non-recyclable material coming back into the system suddenly. So there are huge implications to the whole unlocking and the process of it and how it's all managed. So just some last contributions. Anyone? Obviously, we've got a lot of people from Scotland on the call, representing a wide range of kind of professional and community sports. I'd be interested to hear from any of the people involved with community sport up there, to perhaps just contribute from their perspective. Was that too wide an ask? Okay, not to worry. Russ, are you still on the call?
I am here.
Right.
I'm running through the Zoom chat at the moment.
Okay. Would you like to wrap up then?
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, the last few comments on the chat has come round to, you just mentioned plastics from a safety perspective, but there's been some comments on PPE, but also venues in terms of service, etc., and the concerns that may be around that. I think we mentioned last week about high street coffee implications that this COVID could have moving forward. I mean, it might it might simply be that people are more aware of disease transmission. I mean, we've lived with many infectious diseases, and you could have walked into any stadium in the country over the last 10 years and there would be a handful of people there who've got something that is unpleasant and could be communicated. So COVID is a particularly aggressive new virus that's come out, but you could be sat next to somebody who's you know, they've got a ticket to their favourite sport, so even though so we do live with these things. We do live with communicable diseases. It's just that it's manageable, and that's the point that we're going to get to in the future. So again, I'll just repeat that all of these issues come down to management, and at the moment we're in that crisis position where we actually don't know, and that is the hardest place to do any kind of management moving forward. Whether you're I'll say simply in inverted commas, but whether you're just managing your venue or you're managing your venue in a more sustainable way. I truly believe that this could well be a turning point. It needs to be a turning point. The public attitude and I think the political will is now coming round to a more sustainable response, and this being an opportunity to do that. And I think sport needs to recognise that, and we do need to come through. And just specifically on the plastics, it's been mentioned in each of our webinars, and I think we're going to do a webinar purely on plastics and recycling and how COVID actually impacts those sorts of things. It's a very practical question. But I'll hand back, Chris. We are at 3 o'clock.
Yep.
I've enjoyed it again. Thank you to everybody for joining in, but I'll hand back to Chris.
Great, thanks, Russ. Yes, as you said, 3 o'clock already, and just want to express our thanks to everyone who contributed. Pete, thanks very much and Steve. And please tune in again next week. We're going to continue running these for the foreseeable future, hopefully with topics that are interesting and informative for you. Just to remind you of our website, it's www.basis.org.uk. So please visit and please sign up to the website. And we look forward to seeing you all next week.